Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special midweek pre-nationals or during nationals episode of the Rocker Skating Podcast. We're going to go through a lot of stuff today, and it's going to be a little nerdy and maybe a little bit intense. So hold on to whatever you need to hold on to, because there's going to be a lot that we're going to talk about today. So the story of today is Olympic selection procedures across countries. And one of the things that happens every 4 years is people go and look at the national championships and they say, oh, these people were in the top 1, 2, or 3, or whatever it is. They must be going to the Olympics. It's not as simple as that. And in many instances, especially in large powerhouse figure skating countries of the world, that is certainly not the case. There is a whole set of criteria that these countries look at in order to ascertain the best team to put forth at the Olympics. And by best, usually that means the team with the highest scoring / placement potential out of the competitors. And so the national championships has a lot. Like it plays a huge role in who ends up getting to the Olympics, but it is not the end all. And so there have been instances where you have seen skaters bomb an entire season and then come to nationals and do the best thing that they could possibly do and finish on the podium and get left off the team. And this is the case for both the Olympics and Worlds and for continents, all that kind of stuff. It depends on the country. It depends on what the procedures are. And so I'm going to go through 8 countries today, and they are 8 of generally the most talked about countries. And so we'll go through what the criteria is, and we will go through what's currently the standings as we know it, as the criteria have stated. And so I will say full disclosure that there's nothing official about any of this except for the rules themselves. So any sort of calculations that I have done, it is based on the best of my knowledge and the best of my abilities to do them. I will continue to calculate, recalculate, check my calculations, all of that sort of stuff over the next month or so while all of these national championships are going. So please bear with me. But we will go through some easy ones first, and then we will get into some more complicated ones. And for those of you who are familiar with nationals and the Olympic selection procedures, you will know which ones the complicated ones are. So let's get to it. So we're going to start off with South Korea. So South Korea is probably the easiest. South Korea and China are the easiest of the countries. And so they basically take 2 competitions into account, and they add the 2 competitions up, and whoever is in the top whatever number of skaters that they have qualified for will be assigned to the Olympics. So for the Olympics for South Korea, it is the ranking competition that we have talked about on the podcast, which happened in late November. So half of the selection has already happened, or half of the selection criteria has already happened. And then the national championships, which will happen in the first week of January. So very simple, right? Very simple. What we are seeing right now with the standings after the ranking competitions is there are 2 spots for the men and 2 spots for the women. Junwon Cha is in the lead for the men, 2:55.72. Hyungyong Kim, who qualified the 2nd spot for South Korea at the Olympic qualifying competition earlier this season, is in 2nd, 2:31.52. So those 2 were the top 2 senior eligible or Olympic eligible skaters at the ranking competition. And then you have three others who follow. And so Jae Kun Lee, Si Hyung Lee, and Young Yun Cha are somewhere in the 12 to 29 points behind Hyung Young Kim. And so, again, this is a very simple add them up. So, Hyung Young Kim has a very comfortable lead right now, but that's not to say that it is insurmountable. And so he will need to continue skating well at nationals in order to get that spot. On the other hand, if any of those three who are in the third, fourth, and fifth positions right now skate very well, they can also get to the Olympics. And Jungwon Cha has a fairly sizable 35-point lead over the third place man right now, and so you have to think that his spot is fairly secure. Knock on wood. For the women, from the ranking competition, Jia Shen with a 216, Cheon Kim with a 204. Those two are they both have a comfortable lead. Jia obviously has a much more comfortable lead over the rest, and then it's Hae-in Lee with a 195, so 9 points behind Cheon Kim for Hae-in Lee, and then Ah Sun Yun and Young Yu are a little bit further behind, so they will need to make up a deficit of over 25 points in order to get onto that Olympic team. So just as with the men, with Junwan Cha, Jia Shin looks to be fairly comfortable, but these women are all very talented, so we will see where all of that goes. For dance, Korea has one spot, and so they have one dance team, and and it will be Lim and Kwan going to the Olympics. So easy, right? South Korea. We're gonna go to another fairly easy one, which is China. And just like South Korea, it is as an addition of two competitions. For China, it is the addition of Cup of China, which happened in late October, and then the national championships, which will happen the week after Christmas or the week of Christmas. So it's like that, I think the 25th to 28th or something like that. And so the standings going into the national championships from Cup of China, they have one spot for each of the four disciplines. And so for pairs, Sui and Han has a 7-point lead over Zhang and Huang. In dance, Wang and Liu have a 12-point lead over Ren and Jing, and Xiao and He are in third, and they trail by 22 points from Wang and Liu. So Wang and Liu have a pretty comfortable lead. Ice is slippery. The women, there were three women at the at Cup of China to begin with, but Xiang Yin An did not ended up withdrawing from that competition, so it ended up being two. So Ri Yang Zhang with a 179, 17 points over Yi Zhu, who went to the 2022 Olympics. That's a fairly sizable lead, and Yi Zhu is going to have to skate the performances of her life and hope that Ru Yang Zhang makes some mistakes in order to get back to the Olympics. For the men, similarly, Bo Yang Jin has a very, very large lead, 35 points over Dai Wei Dai, and then 48 points over Jiming Peng. So you would think also that Bo Yang Jin has a pretty good shot at the Olympics. So across the four, Cup of China really kind of blew out the standings for the top spot for dance, women, and men. For pairs, that's the closest one, but you would expect Sui and Han to have made some improvements since Cup of China, and we'll see where they end up at the end of all of this. Okay, there's a reason I'm talking about Estonia. And Estonia is interesting because they have one spot for the men and one spot for the women. But we heard from Alexander Selevko earlier in the season through the media, I think it was through some mixed zone interviews, that they think that the criteria for the Olympics is adding up two competitions in the fall. And that is the case, but for Europeans. And so for the Olympics criteria for Estonia, it is uh, selected based on the analysis of the results from challengers, Grand Prix, and Europeans. Note that Estonian nationals, which is happening this week, does not figure into this criteria. And so what's interesting here is there's one spot for the men, one spot for the women. Let's go to the women first, actually. For the women, Nina Petrikina has a fairly sizable lead over Natalie Langerbauer and Kristina Lisovskaya. So Petrikina had a 178 at Tallinn Trophy, and Natalie Langerbauer had a 157 at Golden Spin, and Lisovskaya had a 156 at Warsaw Cup, so a fairly comfortable lead. Now, all three of these women will end up going to Europeans because the European Championships has 3 spots for the Estonian women because Nina Petrikina won it last year. And so that is for the women where that's going to go. They will look at what happens at Europeans, but Nina Petrikina has a fairly comfortable lead right now going in. For the men, the interesting thing is that Europeans, there are only 2 spots for Estonia for Europeans. And so if you looked at the scores from the Grand Prix and the Challenger Series and you added them up, the 2 who are in the lead are Alexander Selevko and Michał Selevko. And that means, if I am not mistaken, and if I'm not reading the rules wrong, that the Selevko brothers go to Europeans and Arlet Levandi does not. And so Arlet Levandi has been the number 3 in all of these competitions in both the Grand Prix and the Challenger Series so far. And so it would have been a long shot anyway to get that top spot, but because of the Europeans' criteria and the fact that they only have 2 spots, you would think that because they are analyzing results from challengers, Grand Prix, and Europeans, that Arlet Levandi is likely out of the running for the Olympics. And so it'll be between the Selevko brothers for that one spot. Okay, now we get even more interesting now. Italy. Much like what we heard from Alexander Selevko, there was a thought from Nikolai Memola earlier in the season that you take 2 competitions and you add Italian nationals and voila, you've got the Olympic team. It's fairly similar to that, but it's not quite that easy. And there are also, I was reading the rules. Obviously, it was translated from Italian, and so I want to make sure that I'm giving this the right kind of translation interpretation justice. But basically, for Italy, it is the sum of 3 scores across 3 events. So Italian nationals, which happens next week, so not this weekend, but next weekend. Will count for one of those scores, and it will count at a factor of 1. So 100% of those points will count. And then added to that, 2 more events, 2 international or domestic competitions. And here's where the criteria maybe is a little bit unclear / murky. They have what they're called Type A competitions and Type B competitions in their ranking criteria. And Type A competitions basically Grand Prix. There are other Type A competitions, but those don't happen until later in the season, and those are for end of season ranking points for funding and international assignments for next season and all that kind of stuff. And then there is also then Type B competitions, which are basically Challenger Series events, other international competitions, inter-club competitions, test skates, that sort of stuff. Type A competitions are counted at a factor of 1. So again, 100% of those scores will count. And then the Type B competitions count at 0.95, and so 95% of the total scores of those count. Are you still with me? Um, Here's where the interesting thing happens. There is a rule B5 in the ranking calculations that says that you basically have to have a maximum of one Type B competition in your rankings. Now, the rule B20, which is part of the Olympics rules, says the two highest total scores obtained in Type A or B competitions. I'm reading all of this to say that you have to have one A and a maximum of one B. So you can have two A if you want. The other sort of wrinkle that comes into this whole thing is that there's another sort of sub clause rule in a different document about the selection and the basically the placement of people on the Olympic team that says if the ranking point totals for the men is within 30 points of each other, or for the other disciplines within 20 points of each other, the technical commission may propose the call-up of athletes in substitute positions, taking into account ISU ranking. That is how it is translated when I have translated it. So again, sort of a disclaimer that it could be different when you are reading it in Italian, but that I have tried to confirm this with my Italian friends, and they all say that that is what it says. So let's take a look at how it's going into the Italian national championships. So we look at the basically the standings if there's only one Type B allowed. So if you have to have a Type A competition in this whole thing. For pairs, fairly straightforward. Conti Macci and Ghilardi Ambrosini are your two, and you have two spots. And that's because Beccari Guarise did not have a Grand Prix event. They had to withdraw from their only Grand Prix event after the short program because of injury. And so they don't have a Type A competition to count. And so if you go the other way and you allow two Type B competitions to happen, right? You count both of Beccari Guarise's Challenger Series events, it's still Conti Macci and Ghilardi Ambrosini with a very comfortable margin. Beccari Guarise are then about 46 points behind Ghilardi Ambrosini. So you would again think that the two spots for the Italian pairs is fairly straightforward. For the men, this is where it gets a little bit trickier, right? Daniel Grassel in both scenarios, if you have to count a Grand Prix or if you don't have to count a Grand Prix, is in a very large lead over Nikolai Memola, 74, 75 points. And so you add all of those together, his Grand Prix final score helped a lot. And so you would expect Daniel Grasso to basically have one of those spots. And so the fight for the second spot will then be between Memola and Matteo Rizzo. And if you took a Grand Prix and a Challenger or a test skate, Nikolai Memola has a lead of about 16 points. If you didn't have to count a Grand Prix, Matteo Rizzo did better in non-Grand Prix events. And so Nikolai Memola then has a lead of about 9 points going into nationals. So either way, it's still somewhat close, and we know it's men. So you have to count 100% of your Italian championship score. And so Matteo Rizzo needs to skate some clean programs and kind of, hope that Memola makes some mistakes in order to make up that deficit. Now, here's where also that point total less than 30 points for the men comes into play, because right now we're talking about a 16-point difference or a 9-point difference, right? Either way, that's less than 30 points. And so there is a scenario based on the rules where The rankings will have it that Grasso and Memola get assigned to the Olympics. Rizzo gets the first substitute, but because it's less than 30 points, this technical commission may propose the call up of Matteo Rizzo to get on the team, and Matteo Rizzo's ISU ranking is currently higher than Nikolai Memola's. So there's the wrinkle. But I think that even that call up, right, needs to be then it's subject to approval and all that kind of stuff. So, it's, we'll get there if we get there. That's could be a little bit tricky on that front. For the women, Larinaki Gutmann, based on her 2 Grand Prix events that were stellar, has a 45-point lead over Anna Pezzetta. And so you would also then expect that there's 1 spot for the women, right? So that you would expect that Gutmann has a fairly comfortable lead going into the national championships. If you looked at the scenario where 2 Type B competitions are allowed, Serena Jose also then gets into the picture because her Challenger Series point totals are similar to Anna Pezzetta's point totals, and so they're basically tied for second. Now, all of this is to say that the way that I read the rules is that you have to count a Grand Prix event, and then your second competition has to be can be a Grand Prix or a Type B event depending on how you did. And so all of that is to say these spots are fairly cut and dry, but the men is where the national championships is going to be the most critical to basically the fight between Nikolai Memola and Matteo Rizzo. And ice dance, there's 1 spot for the Olympics, and so we assume that Guignard Fabry takes that spot. So I'm not going to go into the calculations for that one. All right, France. Now, we start now getting into more nebulous territory in the sense that it is less of we're going to add up the scores and more about quote unquote analysis or groupings. And so for France, their criteria for the Olympic spots are based on quote unquote analyses, whatever that means. So they're going to look at head-to-head matchups. So if you and somebody else were at the same competition, how you did against each other. And then they're going to also analyze the performances at the Senior Grand Prix, the Senior Masters, the Challengers competitions, and the National Championships. So that's fairly straightforward, but less straightforward in the sense of we don't know what this analysis means, but we can talk about who is, based on the results of the season, who is likely going to be in the conversation for that analysis. So the men, there are 2 spots based on what everything has been going on. Kevin Amos and Adam Seohim-Fa, we're assuming that they get the spot. I'll do another podcast at some point about the World Championships where they have 3 spots, and in that case, the 3rd spot actually right now is a fight between Francois Pitot and Luc Economides. So that one could get interesting come Europeans. For the women, there's 1 spot, and it is really between Laureen Shield and Leah Serna. And in the Grand Prix, Laureen Shield, fairly decisive point totals over Leah Serna, especially at Grand Prix de France, where Laureen Shield had that massive 189, her career best score, and in that head-to-head, she beat Leah Serna by 25 points. So that's nothing to sneeze at. Finlandia Trophy, she was Lorene Shield was a little bit more down to earth, and Leah Serna at Skate America was able to make some improvements, and so those two scores are actually fairly similar. Now, the interesting thing is the most recent head-to-head, which is last week at Golden Spin, where Leah Serna turned the tables and beat Lorene Shield by 9 points. So if we're looking at analysis, head-to-heads, and momentum, right, based on that competition alone, and also based on how Leah Serna has improved during the season, and how Lorene Shield seems to have taken a step back in her consistency during the season, you would actually kind of expect Leah Serna and Lorene Shield to have a real battle at nationals, and that, if Leah Serna beats Lorene Shield again at nationals, then you would imagine that Leah Serna would get the spot. But again, we don't know what analysis means, and we don't know how much of the earlier season results where Lorene beat Leah at French Masters and at the Grand Prix de France, right? And we don't know how that's going to affect it. So watch for that battle at French Nationals next week. For the pairs, this one gets somewhat interesting. If only, well, for two reasons. One, because Kovalev status is unknown. Camille Kovalev dislocated her shoulder at a Grand Prix and couldn't finish the competition. And so we don't even know if she is able to skate at French Nationals. We will see what happens next week. And so they have one spot, and the spot is for the team event. So there's no individual spot yet that the pairs have gotten for France. There could be a spot that opens up, but that we're not counting on that quite yet. And so the second French team would be Fowler and Bell, who started off the season not so great. They lost to the Kovalevs by 12 points at Grand Prix de France, but last week at Golden Spin, they had one of the best scores that they've ever had, if not the best score that they've ever had, 175. And so that is a swing of almost 30 points from Grand Prix de France. And so if the Kovalevs indeed are back for the national championships, they will have to contend with a high momentum Fowler and Bell for that one team spot. Okay, dance. Dance looks fairly straightforward in the sense of Fournier, Baudry, and Cicerone have one of the spots locked up. They got to the Grand Prix final. They have the best scores of the season. And earlier in the season, it looked like it was going to be between Loparieva, Brissot, and Demojo and Le Mercier, especially at French Masters, where the difference between those two teams was only 3 points. Since then, Loparieva, Brissot have outscored Demojo, Le Mercier at all of the Grand Prix events, and these were head-to-head, right? So head-to-head in China, head-to-head at Skate America, and then the only place where Demojo and Le Mercier had a high score that was higher than anything that Loparieva and Brissot had scored was at Golden Spin last week, 187. But then a week before that, Loparieva and Brissot had 202.06 at Warsaw Cup. So again, I think that one is fairly cut and dry. The women will be the one to watch at French Nationals. And then if the Kovalevs are back, the pairs will also be one to watch. All right, let's go to Japan. Japan is another interesting one. It gets more and more complex as we move along. So for Japan, the singles, there are 3 spots for the singles. and then there are two spots for pairs and one spot for dance. And uh, singles is where things get tricky and things get a little bit complicated. So the most straightforward thing is that whoever wins nationals goes to the Olympics. That is very simple. And then we start talking about groupings. So after that first spot is taken, the second spot goes to a skater who is in a grouping that includes the following criteria: getting second or third at nationals, being one of the top two Japanese competitors at the Grand Prix final, and then being one of the top three in ISU season bests for Japan. And then the third spot will then go to anyone from the second spot or the second group, right? The group that I was just talking about, who was not selected. And in addition to that, additional groupings are, or additional people who are going into that grouping are the top three in the ISU World Standings, the top three in Japan Skating Federation's international competition formula that I have not had a chance to decipher because obviously I had to translate all of this. Um, it has something to do with a bunch of different competitions, and you have to average some scores and all that kind of stuff. And then there's then also the average score across other international events, plus sectionals, plus junior sectionals, plus junior nationals. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into this final grouping. And so if you just looked at, and the best ones that we can look at so far are the Grand Prix final, top two, um, the the top three ISU season's best scores, and then the top three ISU world standings. And so for the men, there are three spots. Yuma Kageyama, Shun Sato were the two Japanese men to qualify for the Grand Prix final, and so they were the top two Japanese men there. Um, for both the ISU season best and the ISU world standings, the top three are Yuma Kageyama, Shun Sato, and Kawamura. So that's how it is going into nationals. Now, outside looking in, if you looked at the next season's best and the next world standings, you have then Kazuki Tomono and Sota Yamamoto, who are part of that group that can then get into that third criteria group. Or if either of those guys can finish on the podium at nationals, they then get into that second grouping. So this is where nationals becomes a very kind of heated spot, right? Because if you finish second or third at nationals, you automatically get sort of like multiple chances at these groupings, which is why that is going to be so valuable. All right, for the women, the top two at the Grand Prix final were Ami Nakai and Kaori Sakamoto. Ami was the silver medalist, Kaori Sakamoto was the bronze medalist. And then you look at the ISU season's best, and as expected, right, Kaori Sakamoto, Ami Nakai, Mone Chiba. Top three ISU world standings takes out Ami Nakai, but inserts Hana Yoshida, a name that we have not been hearing this season as much because she's been fairly inconsistent. But however that works, right? Like she is still going to be considered for the Olympic team because she is in the top three Japanese ISU world standings. So that's the women and the men. And for pairs, we are assuming that Miura Kihara and Nagaoka Moriguchi gets the two spots. And then for dance, there's one team spot. And we are assuming that Yoshida Morita gets that one team spot. Japanese nationals is going to be fascinating. All right. Let's get even more complicated with the U.S. Olympics selection process. And this I don't know if it gets more and more complicated or more and more, I don't know, more and more something. But basically, what happens is there are skaters who get into what is called the athlete pool. And then the selection committee will then go look at the athlete pool and select. And they obviously take into account all of these things, right? But in order to be in the athlete pool, i.e., in order to be considered for the Olympics, there are multiple things, right, that are part of the criteria to be in the athlete pool. So um, the first one is they actually write results from 2026 nationals and 2025 worlds. I have to look at the thing again, but I don't know what that actually means. Like what results? Like top five is a results, or you make it to worlds as a result? I'm not really sure. Get back to you on that one. If you were a 2022 Olympics medalist, you are in the pool. Therefore, someone like Madison Chalk and Evan Bates getting a team medal, right? That gets them into the athlete pool. If you're in the top 24 in the ISU World Rankings, that gets you into the athletes pool. And then there's something that says additions by the selection committee based on discretionary criteria. Again, I have to take a look at that and figure out what the discretionary criteria is. But the thing that is probably the most the most easy to digest and also very hard to digest is this next set, which is the calculation of performance criteria. And there's a whole spreadsheet that US Figure Skating will be using to determine the top 5 athletes in this calculation. And so what what is important is that as nationals approaches, these competitions that are closer and closer to nationals and are prestigious get higher factors into the calculation of performance data. So nationals has a factor of 4. So if you score 200 points at nationals, your calculation is 800 points. The Grand Prix final or the Junior Grand Prix final gets a factor of 3. So that is one of the reasons why it is very crucial or very important for people to get into the Junior Grand Prix final or the Grand Prix final. So, for example, Zengas Kolesnik, right? Because they got into the Grand Prix final, they automatically have a heads up into getting into this performance criteria athlete pool. And someone like a Lucius Kazanecki, who qualified for the Junior Grand Prix final, right? He gets a leg up because his total score at Junior Grand Prix final gets multiplied by 3 and added to this thing. So there's kind of no way that he doesn't finish in the top 5 for the performance criteria because he has that advantage of this extra competition that other people aren't counting. And then you go down the list and there's Grand Prix. The highest score gets a 1.5 factor. The average score across the Grand Prix or Junior Grand Prix gets a factor of 1.25. Other international competition, sectional finals, national qualifying series. And then there's what happened last year, right? The best placement from the last Olympics or the last Worlds, so 2022 Olympics or 2025 Worlds. Based on the placement, you get some extra number of points, right? If you won Worlds last year, you get 12 points. And so there are a lot of those kind of things that are part of this. And then nationals from last year, Four Continents, Junior World, all of those end up counting. So then, because we don't have anything else yet, because the nationals hasn't happened and all that kind of stuff, the performance data calculations going into nationals is as follows, right? The women have 3 spots: Alyssa Liu, Amber Glenn, Brady Tennell, Isabel Levito, Sarah Everhart are your top five in that uh, performance data ranking. Elise Lynn Gracie, Star Andrews, Alina Bonillo are in there, but Alina Bonillo is not going to nationals, so basically she's sort of out of the picture there. For the men, Ilya Malinin, Lucius Kazanecki, as I was saying, Jason Brown, Andrew Torgashev, Patrick Blackwell, Tomoka Hiwatashi, Jimmy Ma, Max Naumoff, and then the addition of Jacob Sanchez, who is, I think, number 23 in the ISU World Ranking. Those are the folks who would be kind of in the bubble or in the realm of getting into that top five in the performance data. For the pairs, fairly straightforward. Efimova, Mitrofanov, Cam O'Shea, McBeath Parkman, Shannon Howe, Shin Naj, Lou Bedard, Plazas Fernandez, Williams, and Luer. There are two spots for the pairs. It's still that top five from the performance data and others. And then for dance, Chalk and Bates, Zyngas Kolesnik, Carrera Ponomarenko. So those are your top three in the performance data right now. The Shibutanis, Wolfkostin, Zarevsky, Green, Parsons, Peyton By, and Tway and Rogers. And from a world ranking perspective, Una Brown and Gage Brown are also part of that list. So all of this will change come nationals. And it's also to say that just because you are in the top three of the performance data doesn't mean you get chosen for the Olympics. This just means that the top five in the performance data get into the pool to then be considered by the selection committee, and then they will choose who it is. No doubt that performance and placements and points and standings and all that kind of stuff, all of that counts. But what I would caution folks against is saying the top three in performance data is going to make it to the Olympics. That is not going to be the case. There's a lot that comes through the deliberations of the selection committee. Okay, last one, and I actually don't have any calculations for this one because it's even more, maybe a little bit more nebulous. But for Canada, they have a set of criteria that they will take into account. And so that is through a bunch of things. And it says this is criteria that they take into account, and it is in no specific order. So a lot of qualifications there. If you were a 2024 or 2025 world medalist, you are considered. Your placements and scores from Worlds last season, 4 continents last season, and nationals this season. Anyone who qualified to the 2025 Grand Prix final, so that is to say Piper Gillis, Paul Poirier, and Deanna Stellato Dudek and Maxime Deschamps, those two will be part of the criteria. And then they will then consider season best international scores from last season and this season. And then they will also consider individual international short and free skate scores for the season that are high enough to be in the top 2 flights at the Olympics. So a lot of sort of just like nebulous things here that is not so much of I'm going to add all of this up, but my guess is there's a lot of this that is we're going to put you into groups and determine whether or not you are part of the groups that are going to be considered for the Olympics. And so a reminder, right, that Canada has 1 men's spot, 1 women's spot, 2 pair spots, and 3 dance spots. Okay, that was a marathon. That is all of the nerding that we will do today. I'm sure there will be plenty that we will talk about over the next few weeks as the national championships are happening. And so send questions. I will continue to keep track of everything that is going on so that the folks who are interested, i.e., all of you who are listening to this right now, are continue to be informed. That is also to say, we had our first Olympic team that was announced today, which was Great Britain. And so for Great Britain, it was Vaipan Lon Digby for pairs. It was Fear Gibson and Becker Hernandez for dance. It was Kristen Spars for the women. And then they actually then also have a team event spot. And even though they don't have a men's spot individually, they were able to get a men's spot for the team event. And so Edward Appleby will be in that event for Great Britain. So that is what happens, and that is the first of many Olympic teams to be announced over the next 4 to 5 weeks or so. So that's all for today. I'm going to go take a break and get a drink of water because I talked a lot over the past 45 minutes. Thank you for joining me. I hope this was informative, and we'll talk to you again this weekend.